He owned the company that built one in every 2 cars in Italy. He could make a prime minister and unmake him by lunch. And on a grey November morning, his only son walked to the middle of a motorway bridge outside Turin, looked down at the country his family had built, and stepped off. He was the most powerful man in Italy, the most elegant man in Europe, the envy of kings. And he would outlive almost everyone he was supposed to leave it all to. How does a family that owns a nation fail, again and again, to keep a single heir alive? His name was Gianni Agnelli, and what happened to the heirs of his empire is one of the most quietly buried stories in modern European history. In the next 40 minutes, you'll discover why the family's first golden son was decapitated before he turned 43, what the chosen heir was dying of while the world still called him the future, and the secret about Gianni's own son that the family spent decades trying to keep out of print. This isn't a story about money. It's a warning about what an empire costs the people born to inherit it. And it begins with a single plane. On a summer afternoon in 1935, a small boy stands at the edge of a lake in northern Italy, watching a seaplane taxi across the water toward the dock. He is 14 years old. The man stepping down onto the float is his father, handsome, adored, the heir to one of the richest fortunes on the continent. The boy waves. It is the last ordinary afternoon of his childhood. Within minutes, the propeller of that aircraft will end his father's life, and the boy on the dock will inherit something far heavier than grief. He will inherit the empire. To understand the Agnellis, you have to start with the man who built the machine, Giovanni Agnelli, the grandfather. In 1899, in a cafe in Turin, he and a handful of investors founded a company with an unwieldy name, Fabbrica Italiana di Automobili Torino. 4 initials, Fiat. Giovanni was a former cavalry officer with the cold patience of a general and the instincts of a gambler. He did not want to make cars for the rich. He wanted to put Italy on wheels. Every worker, every farmer, every family. And he did. By the 1920s, Fiat wasn't a car company. It was Turin. The factories, the workers' housing, the newspaper, the football club. The city ran on Agnelli money and answered to Agnelli will. When you controlled Fiat, you controlled the economic heartbeat of an entire region, and through it, the politics of a nation. Giovanni had a son to pass it to, Edoardo Agnelli, born in 1892, charming, restless, more interested in pleasure than in production lines. Edoardo bought into the Juventus football club and turned it into a powerhouse. He married a woman of stunning beauty and ancient blood, Virginia Bourbon del Monte, a princess by lineage. Together they had 7 children. The dynasty looked unbreakable. 2 generations of power, a fortune that only grew, a house full of heirs. This was the peak. A family that had everything money could build and bloodline could promise. The grandfather's genius, the son's glamour, 7 healthy children carrying the name forward. They had the factories. They had the football club. They had the city. They had a future that looked, from the outside, completely guaranteed. They had everything. Then came the seaplane. July 1935. Edoardo was flying home, returning to Genoa from the coast in his father's Savoia Marchetti seaplane. The landing on the water should have been routine, but as the aircraft touched down in the harbour, a float struck a piece of floating debris. The plane pitched violently, the propeller tore loose, and in an instant, in front of witnesses, the heir to the Fiat empire was killed, decapitated, by the very machine age his family had built their name upon. He was 43 years old. Notice that detail, because the family never could escape it. The Agnellis made their fortune from engines, from speed, from machines that moved faster than any human had moved before. And it was a machine, a propeller, a few seconds, a piece of bad luck on calm water, that took their golden son first. The thing that built them began, that day, to take them apart. Before we go on, you need to understand one thing about this family. They did not break in public, ever. The grief was real, but the empire could not be seen to wobble. And so a 14-year-old boy, Edoardo's eldest son, named Giovanni after his grandfather, called Gianni by everyone, was quietly marked as the future. The next 5 years would test that boy in ways no fortune on earth could prepare him for. Because the propeller was only the first cut. The Agnelli curse, as Italy would come to call it, had just begun. For a moment, life went on. The grandfather, old Giovanni, was still alive and still in command. The 7 children still had their mother, Virginia, beautiful and devoted, holding the family together at the villa in Villa Perosa. There were summers on the coast, winters in the mountains, the rituals of an aristocratic Italian childhood. Servants, tutors, the illusion that the worst had already happened and the family had survived it. It hadn't. The worst was a habit now, and it had learned the family's address. In 1945, as the war that had torn Italy apart finally ended, the Agnellis lost 2 pillars in a single year. The grandfather, Giovanni, the founder, the patriarch, the man who had turned 4 initials into an empire, died that December, his company compromised by its wartime entanglements, his city in ruins around him. And before that, the family lost Virginia. Eduardo's widow, mother of the 7 children, was killed in a car accident. A car. Read that again. The family whose entire fortune was built on the automobile. The family that had put Italy behind the wheel, lost the golden sun to an aircraft propeller, and then lost his widow to a car on an Italian road. The machines giveth, the machines taketh away. By the end of 1945, the 7 Agnelli children were orphans, and the empire had no adult Agnelli at its head. Into that vacuum stepped the boy from the dock. Gianni. He was 24 now, and he had decided, it seemed, to spend his inheritance on being young. Through the late 1940s and early 1950s, Gianni Agnelli became the most famous playboy in the world. Yachts on the Riviera, Hollywood actresses, all-night parties, a wardrobe so effortlessly perfect that men across 3 continents copied the way he wore his watch over his shirt cuff. The Italian press adored him. The world's photographers chased him. He was rich, beautiful, grieving in the only way he knew how, by refusing to stop moving. And then the machines came for him too. In 1952, on a road on the French Riviera, at night, Gianni's car slammed into a truck. His leg was crushed, shattered so badly that he would walk with a limp and a brace for the rest of his life, the pain never fully leaving him. He had been driving fast, the way the men in his family always did. He survived. But something shifted in him that night. The endless party had a bottom, and he had hit it. Gianni Agnelli had been the golden boy of a cursed family. He had watched his father die, lost his mother and grandfather in a single year, and very nearly thrown his own life onto a French road for the thrill of it. The story of the first generation was a story of sudden, violent loss. A propeller, a car crash, a war's end. Fast deaths, shocking deaths. The kind that make headlines and then fade. But the death that would define this family, the one that would reveal the curse for what it truly was, wouldn't come fast. It would take decades. It would come for the very heir Gianni would one day groom to replace him. And it would arrive not as an accident, but as a diagnosis no fortune on earth could buy its way out of. Because the cruelest thing about the Agnelli curse was not how it killed, it was how patient it could be. By the 1960s, the playboy had become a king. Gianni Agnelli took control of Fiat in 1966, and for the next 30 years, he didn't just run a car company, he ran Italy. Prime ministers came to him. When the lira trembled, the world watched Turin. He was called L'Avvocato, the lawyer, though he never practiced law a day in his life. The title meant something else. It meant the man whose word was final. He turned Fiat into a colossus that, at its height, accounted for nearly 5% of Italy's entire economy. One company, one family, one man. He had married too. In 1953, Gianni wed Marella Caracciolo, a Neapolitan aristocrat, a woman of cool elegance who would become one of the most photographed style icons of the century. And together, they did the one thing every dynasty requires. They produced an heir, a son, Edoardo, named, as the tradition demanded, after Gianni's own lost father, the man on the seaplane, and a daughter, Margherita, born the following year. The line was secure. There was a boy to carry the name, the empire, the throne. Everything the propeller had nearly destroyed in 1935 had been rebuilt and made ready to hand down. Except the boy did not want the throne. Here is the wound at the center of this family, the one the curse pressed on hardest. Gianni Agnelli, the most powerful man in Italy, who could bend banks and governments to his will, could not shape his own son. Edoardo grew into a sensitive, searching young man, drawn not to balance sheets, but to mysticism, to religion, to questions about meaning that the world of fiat had no answer for. He traveled to the East. He studied faith. He struggled, privately and then publicly, with drugs. In 1990, he was detained in Kenya over a small quantity of heroin, and the story the family had worked so hard to contain spilled into the newspapers. And Gianni, we have to be honest about this, because it is the heart of the tragedy, let it be known that his son would not inherit the empire. The boy born to be king was, in his father's eyes, not the man for the crown. Imagine being Edoardo Agnelli. Imagine carrying the most powerful name in your country, bearing the name of your grandfather who died a hero's death, and knowing that the one man whose approval you craved had looked at you and quietly turned away. So Gianni looked elsewhere for his heir, and he found one. His name was Giovanni Alberto Agnelli, called Giovannino, the son of Gianni's younger brother Umberto. And he was everything the dynasty dreamed of: brilliant, charming, disciplined, comfortable in the world of industry, in a way Edoardo never was. Giovannino ran Piaggio, the company behind the Vespa, and ran it well. He was handsome and warm, and the family adored him. By the mid-1990s, it was understood across Italy, this was the future. This was the young man who would one day sit where l'Avvocato sat. The crown had found its head. You can feel the cruelty assembling itself, can't you? Because we have already learned the lesson of this family. The Agnelli curse is patient, it waits, and it has a particular taste for the heir. In 1997, Giovannino, 33 years old, married, a new father, the designated future of the entire dynasty, was diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of intestinal cancer. There was no playboy's luck to be had this time, no surviving the crash with only a shattered leg. There was no fast fortune large enough. The richest family in Italy summoned the best medicine money could find anywhere on earth, and it did not matter. Within months, Giovannino was dead, the chosen heir, the repaired future. Gone at 33, leaving an infant son and a family that had, for the second time in its history, watched its anointed successor die young. Not in a war, not in an accident, but slowly, in a hospital bed, while the most powerful man in Italy stood beside it and could do nothing. Gianni Agnelli was nearly 80. He had buried his father, his mother, his grandfather, and now the nephew he had chosen to outlive him. He had no successor, and he still had a son, the son he had passed over. What happened next is the part of this story the family never wanted told. After Giovannino's death, Edoardo believed, not unreasonably, that he should now be considered. He was the blood heir, the actual son. With the chosen one gone, surely the throne came home. But the machinery of the family, the trusts, the holding companies, the advisors, and above all his father's own judgment, had already begun turning toward another name entirely: Gianni's teenage grandson, Margherita's boy, John Elkann. A grandchild was being prepared for the role the son was told. Again, he could not have. For Edoardo, it was the second rejection, and it landed on a man already carrying more than he could bear. On November 15, 2000, Edoardo Agnelli drove to a viaduct on the motorway near Fossano, outside Turin, a bridge over the kind of road his family's cars had filled for a century. He left the car, he climbed the barrier, and the only son of the most powerful man in Italy fell more than 250 feet to his death. He was 46 years old. The family called it tragedy. The newspapers, more bluntly, called it what it was. And the country that had watched the Agnellis own its roads, its factories, its very engine, now watched the King of Italy bury his only son. The boy who had been born to inherit everything, and who in the end could not be given the one thing he wanted, which was simply to be chosen: the propeller in 1935, the car crash that took Virginia, Giovannino's cancer, and now a bridge over a motorway. 4 heirs. 4 ways for an empire to lose the people it was built to protect. And Gianni Agnelli, almost 80, broken in the leg and now in the heart, had one task left: to find someone, anyone, to carry the name into a century he would not live to see. They say the elegance never left him, even at the end. Even when the body was failing and the family around him was thinning out like a forest after a long fire, Gianni Agnelli kept the watch over the shirt cuff, the perfectly knotted tie, the cool half-smile he had worn since he was the most beautiful young man on the Riviera. The style was the last thing the curse could not take, so he kept it. But behind the elegance, the final years were a slow accounting of everything that had gone. By 2002, Gianni was dying of prostate cancer. He knew it. He had spent his whole life refusing to wobble in public, and he did not intend to start now. But those close to him described a man turning the same questions over and over in the quiet. He had been given everything a man could be given: beauty, power, a fortune most countries would envy, the love of the public, the fear of the powerful, the company of the century's most famous faces. And he had outlived almost every person who was supposed to carry it forward. Think about what he had survived to reach this point. He had stood on a dock as a boy and watched his father die. He had lost his mother and his grandfather in a single year and become an orphan at 24. He had crawled out of a wrecked car on a French road and walked in pain for 50 years afterward. He had chosen a nephew to be his heir and watched cancer take him at 33. And he had buried his only son, who had stepped off a bridge, in part because of a throne his father would not give him. The empire was still there. That was the strange, hollow thing. Fiat still made the cars. The family still held the wealth. The name still opened every door in Italy. But empires are supposed to be for something. They are supposed to be the gift you hand to your children. And Gianni Agnelli had run out of children to hand it to. So he reached past a generation. He fixed his hopes on the grandson, John Elkann, Margherita's son, a serious and capable young man who had been quietly prepared, groomed in the way Giovannino once had been, to one day hold the thing that had cost the family so much. It was, in its way, an act of faith. After everything the curse had done, Gianni Agnelli was still betting on the next Agnelli to survive long enough to matter. On January 24, 2003, Gianni Agnelli died at his home in Turin. He was 81, and Italy stopped. More than 100,000 people filed past his coffin. Strangers wept in the street. The man who had been called the King of Italy, the uncrowned monarch of a republic, was mourned as if a real throne had emptied. For a day, the country that ran on Agnelli machines stood still for the man who had built and embodied them. But the curse was not finished. It rarely is, in this family. Just over a year later, in May 2004, Umberto Agnelli, Gianni's younger brother, the last of the 7 children born to the golden son who died on the seaplane, and the father of the heir Giovannino, who had died of cancer, also died of cancer. He had taken the chairmanship of Fiat after Gianni's death. He held it for barely a year. Within 16 months of the king, the last brother was gone too, taken by the same patient killer that had taken his son. Stop and look at what the curse had done in the space of a single decade. Giovannino, the chosen heir, dead at 33, 1997. Edoardo, the only son, dead on a bridge, 2000. Gianni, the king, dead of cancer, 2003. Umberto, the last brother, dead of cancer, 2004. 4 men, 7 years. The entire visible top of the most powerful family in Italy, erased in less time than it takes a child to grow into a teenager. And the family's troubles did not end with the dying. They moved into the courtrooms. Margherita, Gianni's daughter, now the last surviving child of the king, a woman who had buried her brother and both her parents, became locked in a bitter, years-long legal war over the inheritance, against the very advisors and structures her father had built, and in painful ways against the next generation itself. The fortune that was meant to bind the family had become the thing tearing at what remained of it. This is what an empire costs. Not money. Money the Agnellis always had. It costs heirs. It costs the quiet, ordinary thing every family is supposed to be able to do. Hand what you built to the children you love, and watch them carry it forward. The Agnellis could buy anything on earth. They could not buy that. And yet. And this is where the story turns one final time. The name did not die. Because there was one more chapter the curse hadn't counted on. There was the grandson. There was John Elkann, who had inherited not just a fortune, but a graveyard of expectations, and who would now have to answer the only question that mattered. After everything, the propeller, the crashes, the cancer, the bridge, could anyone actually break the Agnelli curse? The answer would surprise everyone, including the family. When Gianni Agnelli died, the smart money in Italy said the family was finished. Look at the arithmetic of it. The king was gone. His chosen heir was gone. His only son was gone. His last brother was gone within the year. What remained at the top of the most powerful dynasty in Italy was a grandson in his 20s, John Elkann, half Italian, half French, raised partly in Brazil and Britain, a young man most Italians had barely heard of. Fiat itself was bleeding money, losing a reported €1,000,000 a day, circling the drain that swallows every great car company eventually. The vultures were already pricing the carcass. This was the moment the curse had been building toward for 70 years. The propeller, the crashes, the cancer, the bridge. Every blow had been clearing the board, removing every man who was supposed to hold the line, until all that stood between the Agnelli name and history was one untested boy. And here is the revelation. Here is the thing the curse did not count on. The boy held. John Elkann did not run. He did not sell. He did something his glamorous, doomed predecessors might never have managed. He got quiet, got serious, and went to work. He brought in a ferocious outsider executive named Sergio Marchionne, a man in a sweater instead of a suit. And together, they did the impossible. They saved Fiat. Then, in the wreckage of the 2008 financial crisis, they did something no one believed an Italian car company could do. They bought Chrysler. The family that had once put Italy on wheels now reached across the ocean and took hold of an American giant. And Elkann kept building. Under his hand, the empire didn't just survive, it transformed. Fiat and Chrysler became one company, and then, in 2021, merged with the French PSA group to create Stellantis, one of the largest automakers on the planet, a colossus selling cars on every continent under more than a dozen brands. He held Ferrari and took it public and watched the world value that single prancing horse mark at a sum that would have stunned even his grandfather. The football club, Juventus, still flew the family's colours. The boy nobody believed in had not merely preserved the inheritance, he had made it larger than Gianni ever did. Sit with the size of that reversal. For 70 years, this was a story about an empire devouring its heirs, about a family that could buy anything except the survival of the people meant to inherit it. And then the least likely heir of all, the grandson, handed a graveyard, picked up the name, and carried it further than any of the golden, doomed men who came before him. So was there ever really a curse? Here is the truth, and it is more unsettling than any curse. There was no supernatural hand on this family. There was a propeller and a piece of debris on calm water. There was a fast car on a dark road. There was a cancer that does not care how much money is in the room. And there was a young man so crushed by the weight of a name he never asked for, that a bridge looked like the only way down. These were not curses. They were the ordinary tragedies of human life. Illness, accident, despair, magnified to mythic scale, because they happened to a family the whole world was watching. That is the real revelation of the Agnellis. Power does not protect you. Wealth does not protect you. Being called the King of Italy did not buy Gianni Agnelli one extra day with his son, did not buy Giovannino a cure, did not stop a propeller in 1935. The empire could touch everything except the only things that ever truly mattered. And the only thing that finally broke the so-called curse was not more money or more power. It was one ordinary, stubborn, serious young man choosing to carry the weight instead of being crushed by it. The Agnelli name lives today, on millions of cars, on a football club, on one of the great fortunes of Europe. The dynasty endures, but every person who carries it forward now does so in the long shadow of the men who didn't make it. The heir on the seaplane, the boy who chose the bridge, the chosen son who ran out of time at 33. That is what an empire costs, and the Agnellis paid it in full. Remember the bridge from the beginning, the only son of the most powerful man in Italy, stepping off into the dark. Now you know what walked him there. Not a curse, a name too heavy to carry, handed to a man whose own father could not bring himself to choose him. That is the quiet horror underneath all the wealth. The Agnellis could give their children everything, except the one thing a child actually needs. So here is the question to sit with tonight. If power and money and beauty, and a name that opens every door in a nation, could not save a single one of these heirs from the ordinary tragedies that find us all, then what, exactly, were they protecting? What is an empire even for, if it cannot keep safe the people it was built to hand down to? The Agnellis are not the only dynasty to learn that lesson the hard way. Across the Atlantic, another family built a fortune so vast it seemed untouchable, and watched a curse of their own take son after son, in cars, in planes, in ways the world is still arguing about. They were called American royalty, and their story makes the Agnellis look almost gentle. That story is on the screen right now. Press it, and ask yourself the same question all over again, whether the families we call kings are the most powerful people on earth, or simply the ones whose tragedies we are forced to watch in public.